The courtroom was heavy with silence, a tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. The officer stood there, his uniform crisp, his stance rigid, radiating nothing but arrogance. His eyes, cold and defiant, locked onto the woman in the judge's seat as if she had no right to be there, as if her authority was something he refused to recognize. He wasn't just challenging the law, he was challenging her. She had seen that look before. The look of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. A man who had never been forced to answer for his actions, who walked into any room and expected immediate submission. But today, in her courtroom, that was not going to happen. Her voice was firm, unwavering. "Officer, take your seat." He didn't move. Instead, he let out a slow, mocking chuckle, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, leaning forward, he spoke with a deliberate, venomous tone. "I don't take orders from people like you." The room stiffened. The weight of his words, their unspoken meaning, pressed against every person in attendance. People shifted uncomfortably, waiting for her reaction. But she had been here before. She knew men like him. Knew their games. And she was not going to play. "This is a court of law," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "You will sit down, or you will be removed." His smirk widened. "I'd love to see you try." Then it happened. It was so sudden, so vicious, that the sound of it cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. His fist struck her face with brutal force, snapping her head to the side. Gasps erupted. Someone screamed. Papers scattered as people jumped to their feet in shock. The officer took a step back, chest heaving, as if he had just done something completely justified. As if he had just corrected some sort of mistake that the world had made. She stumbled but didn't fall. No, she wouldn't give him that. She wouldn't let him have that victory. Slowly, she raised her head, wiping the blood from her lip, and locked eyes with him again. And in that moment, the room wasn't watching a victim. They were watching a storm about to break. The arrogance on his face flickered, just for a second. Maybe he expected her to cry. Maybe he thought she would crumble under the weight of what he had just done. But instead, she straightened her robe, took a deep breath, and reached for the gavel. Not to restore order. But to deliver justice. "Officer," she said, her voice clear, sharp as steel. "You just assaulted a sitting judge in a court of law." The room held its breath. He took a step forward, as if he was about to say something, but she raised her hand, and the bailiffs moved. "Arrest him." For the first time since he walked into that courtroom, he looked uncertain. His hands twitched as the officers hesitated, looking at one another, unsure of what to do. He still believed he was untouchable. Still believed that they would never put cuffs on him. Until the first one clicked. The moment metal locked around his wrist, his face twisted in disbelief. "You can't do this," he hissed, struggling, but the bailiffs held firm. "Do you know who I am?" She took a step closer, looking him in the eye. "No," she said, her voice steady. "But after today, everyone will." And just like that, the balance shifted. But what happens when a man who has never faced consequences finally meets justice? And what happens when the people who always protected him realize they can no longer save him? What happened that day in that courtroom was only the beginning. Because when the truth finally came out, no one was ready for it. And neither will you. Hey, family. Before we dive into this powerful story, let's be clear about something. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism, discrimination, and abuse of power. This is a space where we amplify voices, seek justice, and tell stories that matter. To every Black viewer watching, you are powerful, you are valuable, and you deserve respect. No one should ever be mistreated because of the color of their skin. Today's story is a reminder that justice always finds a way. Now, sit back and enjoy the ride. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a twist. Let's go. The morning light seeped through the towering glass windows of the downtown Atlanta courthouse, painting the polished marble floors with streaks of gold. The hum of conversations, the distant echoes of hurried footsteps, and the rustling of legal documents filled the grand hallways. This was a place where justice was supposed to prevail, a pillar of law, a symbol of order. But for Judge Ayana Williams, it was also a battlefield. Ayana had spent years climbing the ladder of the judicial system, fighting through the prejudices and doubts thrown her way. She was the youngest black female judge in the city, a title that came with both admiration and resentment. She had been called too young, too aggressive, too outspoken. But she had also been called something else, the best damn judge the city had ever seen. Raised in a working-class neighborhood in South Atlanta, she had seen firsthand how the justice system could break a person just as easily as it could save them. She watched her father, a hard-working mechanic, be falsely accused of theft when she was just 12 years old. She saw the way the officers treated him, as if his innocence was an inconvenience. She remembered sitting in that courtroom, her small hands clenched into fists, as an overworked public defender barely fought for him. That was the day Ayana decided she would never be powerless again. Law school had been brutal. The expectations were doubled, the scrutiny unrelenting. While others coasted on connections, she had clawed her way up with sheer determination. She graduated top of her class, passed the bar with distinction, and made a name for herself as a ruthless, no-nonsense attorney before being appointed as a judge. She wasn't here to play nice. She was here to hold people accountable. And that, she knew, made her enemies. She straightened her robe, breathing deeply as she prepared for another long day in court. Today's case was going to be ugly. On the other side of town, Officer Jonathan Bryant adjusted his badge in the rearview mirror of his patrol car. The morning sun reflected off the polished silver, but it was the weight of the badge, the authority it carried, that gave him a sense of satisfaction. He had been wearing it for almost 12 years, and in that time, he had learned one thing: people like him were untouchable. Bryant wasn't just an officer. He was a symbol of control. A man who commanded respect, whether it was earned or not. He had patrolled these streets for over a decade, walking with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned, never been challenged in a way that truly mattered. He grew up in a world where power was everything. His father, also a cop, had taught him young, the law is what you make it. People follow orders, or they face the consequences. It was a lesson he carried with him into adulthood, one that had shaped the way he handled his authority. To some, he was a dedicated officer, a protector of the law. To others, he was a bully with a badge, a man who bent the rules when it suited him. He had racked up dozens of complaints over the years: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. But none of them stuck. Because men like Bryant didn't face consequences. He knew today would be different, though. Today, he was being forced to testify in court. And worse, in front of a judge he couldn't stand. Ayana Williams. He had seen her name on the docket and immediately felt his blood boil. A black woman. A judge. Sitting in a position above him, holding authority over him. It was an insult. An offense to everything he believed in. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to have to answer to someone like her. When he walked into the courthouse, heads turned. Some nodded in respect. Others whispered. He knew the rumors: people said he was reckless, that he pushed boundaries. He didn't care. He was here to remind them all who held the real power. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The tension was almost suffocating as Bryant stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his confidence unwavering. He locked eyes with Ayana as she took her seat at the bench. Neither of them blinked. She spoke first, her voice steady, authoritative. "Officer Bryant, please take the stand." He didn't move immediately. He let the moment stretch, watching her, testing her. Then, slowly, he walked forward, his boots echoing against the floor. When he sat down, he leaned back, arms crossed, smirking. He wanted her to know he wasn't intimidated. Ayana was used to this. She had seen it before, the smug arrogance, the silent defiance. Men like Bryant didn't believe in her authority. They resented it. She wasn't here to be liked. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at him. "Officer Bryant, you are aware that you are under oath?" He exhaled sharply, nodding. "Yeah." Her tone didn't waver. "Then let's begin." The questioning started civil enough. Procedural. But as the minutes passed, Ayana's precise, relentless line of questioning began backing him into a corner. She picked apart his report, exposed inconsistencies, highlighted moments where his story didn't add up. The smirk on his face started to slip. She was challenging him. Making him look foolish. Bryant's jaw clenched. His fingers drummed against the stand. The room was watching, waiting. He needed to shut this down. He leaned forward slightly, voice lower, but dripping with venom. "You know, Judge, it's funny, people like you always think they're in control. But the second they step outside these walls, it's a different story, isn't it?" The veiled threat hung in the air. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Ayana felt the heat of dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply met his gaze and held it. Then, calmly, she spoke. "Officer Bryant, you will watch your tone in my courtroom." A flicker of something dark passed through his expression, a crack in his carefully controlled mask. And then, in a split second, everything exploded. He moved too fast. 1 second, he was seated. The next, he was standing, his fist cutting through the air. The impact was deafening. Ayana reeled back as pain exploded across her jaw. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People gasped, some screaming, others frozen in shock. The weight of the moment crashed down on everyone at once. Bryant stepped back, breathing heavily, his knuckles white. For a moment, he seemed almost proud. Like he had finally put her in her place. But then, something shifted. Because she didn't fall. Ayana straightened. Slowly. Deliberately. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, but she didn't wipe it away. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. And then, she smiled. Bryant's confidence shattered. The room held its breath. And then Ayana spoke. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Because Bryant had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. But today, that was about to change. The room was frozen in disbelief. The air itself seemed to tighten, pressing down on every person present, suffocating them with the weight of what had just happened. A sitting judge, had just been struck in her own courtroom, in full view of attorneys, clerks, defendants, and jurors. It was something unthinkable, something that shattered the very concept of law and order. Ayana's cheek throbbed with searing pain, but she barely acknowledged it. She had taken harder hits in life, ones that didn't come with physical bruises but had left marks all the same. This was nothing. What mattered wasn't the pain. What mattered was what came next. Officer Bryant stood before her, his chest rising and falling in sharp, heavy breaths. His knuckles were still clenched, red from the impact. His eyes flickered with something wild, something feral. For a moment, it was like he hadn't fully processed what he'd done. But then, he smirked. A slow, satisfied smirk that sent a wave of cold fury through Ayana's veins. The courtroom, once alive with shock and gasps, now teetered on the edge of chaos. The bailiffs had frozen, uncertain, hesitant, caught in the impossible space between duty and self-preservation. Attorneys whispered in frantic voices, their eyes darting from Ayana to Bryant, waiting to see what would happen next. Ayana exhaled slowly, controlling the fire in her chest, keeping her voice as steady as the walls around her. You think you can walk away from this? It wasn't a question. It was a fact. A statement of pure, unfiltered truth. Because that's exactly what Bryant believed. His smirk deepened, a slow chuckle leaving his lips, rolling over the courtroom like a dark cloud. I don't think, Judge. I know. That was it. That was the entire core of his being summed up in 3 words. He had spent years doing as he pleased, stepping over lines, bending rules, wielding his badge like a weapon. And the worst part? He had never paid for it. Never. Not once. Until now. Ayana took a step forward. The shift in the air was immediate. The court reporters stopped typing. The attorneys stopped whispering. The bailiffs snapped to attention, finally realizing, this wasn't going to end the way it always did. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. A sharp, authoritative voice. Judge Williams. The chief bailiff. A man who had worked alongside her for years. Someone she trusted. Someone who had always shown her respect, but now there was something else in his tone. A warning. Ayana turned her head, her eyes locking onto his. And in that split second, she understood exactly what was happening. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at them. The other officers in the room. Bryant's fellow brothers in arms. Men who were watching this unfold not with horror, not with shock, but with a quiet, simmering tension. Because they were waiting. Waiting to see if they needed to step in. Waiting to see if one of their own was in danger. And that was when it hit her, the realization, sharp and precise like a knife's edge. They weren't concerned that Bryant had hit her. They were concerned about what she was going to do about it. For a long moment, Ayana didn't speak. She simply took in the weight of it all, absorbing the truth that hung so thick in the air it was nearly suffocating. She could feel every gaze on her, burning into her skin, waiting, calculating. She had spent her entire life playing by the rules. The rules had never protected her. The rules had never protected people like her. And Bryant, he knew that. That's why he hit her. That's why he smirked. Because the rules weren't made to hold men like him accountable. She took another breath, her heartbeat slow and measured. Then, with deadly calm, she turned back to him. You just assaulted a sitting judge, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Bryant's expression didn't change. If anything, his smirk grew. And the sheer audacity of the word rang out in the courtroom like a gunshot. And in that moment, Ayana knew exactly what she had to do. But not yet. She wouldn't rush it. Because Bryant had spent years believing himself to be untouchable. Now, she was going to make him feel it. The full weight of his actions. The crushing reality of consequences he had spent his entire life dodging. So she didn't shout. She didn't lash out. She didn't demand justice in a way that could be twisted, rebranded, used against her. She simply looked at the chief bailiff and spoke with chilling clarity. Clear the courtroom. A ripple of confusion spread through the space. Attorneys exchanged glances. Reporters clutched their notes tighter. Even the bailiffs hesitated. Bryant let out a low, mocking laugh. Scared, Judge? She didn't even blink. I said, she repeated, voice unwavering, clear the courtroom. The chief bailiff swallowed, then nodded. He turned, motioning for people to move. One by one, they did. Uncertain. Hesitant. But they did. Some stole glances over their shoulders, eyes flickering between Ayana and Bryant, sensing that something bigger was about to happen. Bryant watched, amused at first. Then, confused. Because she wasn't reacting the way he expected. He expected rage. He expected tears. What he wasn't expecting was calculated silence. Minutes passed. The courtroom emptied. The doors shut. And then, finally, it was just them. Bryant. Ayana. The chief bailiff. And the officers who were still standing there, waiting. Waiting to see if she would really go through with it. Ayana exhaled slowly, lifting her chin, every inch of her presence commanding. Then, with calm precision, she reached for her gavel. Bryant's smirk returned, but this time, there was something uneasy beneath it. For the first time, he didn't know what was coming next. For the first time, he wasn't in control. And that, more than anything else, made the fear creep into his eyes. Ayana tapped the gavel once, steady and deliberate. Then she spoke. Officer Bryant. A pause. Then, you are under arrest. The silence was deafening. But what happened after that? No one was ready for it. The weight of Ayana's words did not just fill the air, it crushed it, making every breath in the room feel heavier, every second feel longer, every single person present feel the undeniable gravity of the moment. The courtroom, despite being vast and expansive, suddenly felt small, as if the walls had closed in, trapping everyone in the consequences of what had just happened. Nobody moved. The chief bailiff stood with his mouth slightly open, as if he had started to say something but then thought better of it. The remaining officers in the room had gone rigid, their hands twitching at their sides, waiting, trying to process what they had just witnessed and what was about to follow. The attorneys, the clerks, even the reporters still lingering near the back, all frozen in place, watching. And in the very center of it all was Jonathan Bryant. The once smug, untouchable officer, the man who had spent years throwing his weight around with impunity, the man who had just done the unthinkable, striking a sitting judge inside her own courtroom, stood there, his fists still clenched at his sides, his body still vibrating with rage, but now there was something else. Disbelief. His lips parted slightly, his eyes darting around the room, scanning for confirmation that this wasn't happening. That this couldn't be happening. That at any moment, someone, anyone, would step forward and tell him that Ayana's words were nothing more than empty noise. Because that's how it had always been. Every time there was a complaint. Every time a civilian tried to push back. Every time someone dared to question his power. It was always nothing. He had been suspended before. Put on administrative leave. Slapped on the wrist. But every single time, he had walked away unscathed, because men like him didn't fall. But this time felt different. The cold weight of reality pressed in on him as the silence stretched, growing thicker, more suffocating with each passing second. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "You're kidding," he muttered, voice sharp but unsteady, like he was trying to convince himself just as much as everyone else in the room. Ayana didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge his attempt to downplay what had just happened. She simply stared at him, calm, resolute, waiting. Bryant exhaled harshly, his breath uneven. "This is a joke," he said again, louder this time, his voice tinged with the first signs of panic. He turned, searching the faces of the other officers, waiting for them to do something. "You can't seriously be going along with this. She's making a scene. She's trying to humiliate me. You all see what this is, right?" Silence. No movement. No answers. The officers, the men who had once stood beside him without question, the ones who had always had his back, were hesitating. And that's when he realized. They weren't sure this time. For the first time in his career, they were second-guessing him. A flicker of something dark crossed his face, something ugly, something that twisted his expression into something even more dangerous. He turned back to Ayana, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can do this," he said, voice low, sharp, almost warning her. She didn't even blink. "I already did." Bryant's body tensed. His breath hitched just slightly, and Ayana saw it, the crack in his composure. He tried to mask it, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The shift had already happened. The chief bailiff took another step forward. The sound of it, just a single step, was like the striking of a match. It sent shockwaves through the moment, making everything feel suddenly, devastatingly real. "Officer Bryant," Ayana said, her voice steady, authoritative, leaving no room for argument. "You are under arrest for the assault of a sitting judge in a court of law." The words slammed into him. Bryant's jaw tightened so hard it looked like his teeth might break. His nostrils flared. His entire body went rigid as he fought the reality that was caving in around him. His voice was tight when he spoke, barely more than a growl. "You don't know what you're doing." Ayana took a step forward. "You assaulted me in front of an entire courtroom. In front of officers. In front of cameras. Do you really think there's a way out of this?" Bryant's chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. "You don't get it," he hissed. "You think the law is on your side? You think any of this matters?" He shook his head, his voice filled with a dangerous kind of certainty. "People like you don't win against people like me." Ayana tilted her head slightly. "And yet, here we are." Bryant's fingers twitched. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she saw it. The temptation. The thought, so quick, so instinctual, that maybe if he just reached for his gun, this could all be erased. The last, desperate attempt at control. Ayana didn't move. Didn't react. Didn't let him see the way her pulse quickened. She simply stared, calm, waiting. And slowly, painfully, he backed down. His fingers uncurled. His shoulders dropped just slightly. But his rage, his hatred, was still there, seething beneath the surface. The chief bailiff extended his hand. A silent command. Bryant's lips pressed together. His face was unreadable now, locked down, shutting out the reality closing in on him. Then, slowly, he reached for the badge pinned to his chest. He hesitated. Just for a moment. Then, with a sharp, defiant movement, he ripped it off and threw it onto the ground. The sound echoed through the courtroom. A final, bitter acknowledgement that the world wasn't bending for him this time. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because as Bryant stood there, stripped of his badge, stripped of everything that had once made him untouchable, the doors to the courtroom swung open. And outside? The press was waiting. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The world had arrived. And Bryant's fall from grace was no longer just a courtroom scandal. It was a national headline. His face twisted in horror as the chief bailiff reached for his wrists, as the cold metal of handcuffs locked around them, as the weight of his actions finally crushed him. The great, untouchable officer Jonathan Bryant, who had spent his entire life believing he was above the law, was now just another mugshot waiting to happen. And Ayana? She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply watched. Because she had waited years for this moment. And now, the world was about to watch him pay for it. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Bryant's wrists, the final clink echoing through the silent courtroom. He barely reacted at first. His jaw was tight, his nostrils flared, but his face, his expression, was locked in a state of stunned, immovable disbelief. His entire world, his very existence, had been built on the idea that this moment could never happen to him. That there would always be a way out, an excuse, a loophole, a favor to call in. But as the press swarmed outside the courtroom doors, as the weight of every flashing camera, every watching eye, bore down on him, he realized, there was no way out of this. The chief bailiff kept a firm grip on his arm, guiding him toward the door, but Bryant dug his heels in, stopping just short of stepping into the hallway. His breathing was uneven, his fingers twitching at his sides, his mind racing for something, anything, that could reverse this nightmare. Then, finally, he snapped. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath, just loud enough for Ayana to hear. "You think you won? You think they'll let this stand?" His voice was sharp, laced with pure, undiluted rage. His lips curled into a sneer, his body stiff, his chest heaving. "You don't understand how this works, Judge. You never did." Ayana stood unmoving, her gaze steady, calm, unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give him anything. And that enraged him even more. "I know people," Bryant continued, his voice dropping into something low and venomous, almost shaking with desperation. "You think the DA's gonna let this go? You think the department's just gonna sit back and watch one of their own get taken down by a—" he caught himself. But Ayana knew exactly what he had been about to say. He did too. The room held the silence between them like a blade, poised in midair, waiting to drop. Ayana finally spoke, her voice quiet but unshakable. "One of their own." She let the words settle, watching as Bryant's throat bobbed, his composure fracturing. "And what exactly does that mean, Officer Bryant?" He didn't answer. Because they both knew what it meant. He had built his entire career on being protected. On being one of them. On knowing that no matter what he did, someone would always be there to clean up his mess. Until now. Ayana took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough that her voice didn't need to rise, just enough that he could feel the weight of her words pressing into him like iron. "You walked into this courtroom believing you were untouchable," she said, her tone almost calm, but beneath the surface was something sharper, something dangerous. "You struck a sitting judge, in front of witnesses, in front of officers, on camera, and you still, believe you can walk away from this?" She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto his. "Tell me, Bryant. What exactly does it feel like to lose?" Something inside him snapped. His body jerked forward, like he wanted to lunge at her, but the chief bailiff's grip tightened around his arm, yanking him back just as quickly. Bryant's breath was harsh, his pulse pounding, his chest rising and falling like he was trying to contain something explosive inside him. "You don't get to do this to me," he spat, his voice breaking, the thin thread of control he had left snapping apart. "You think you're different? You think you matter? You're just another name they'll forget. Another headline. Another." Ayana took another step forward. But this time, Bryant took a step back. He didn't even realize he had done it. The movement was instinctual. Like he was afraid. Like, for the first time in his life, he was the one being cornered. And the realization, the weight of it, hit him all at once. Because that's what this was. He wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one holding the power. He wasn't the one people feared. He was just a man in handcuffs. A criminal. And the whole world was about to see him that way. Ayana didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't let herself revel in the moment, not because she didn't want to, but because this wasn't about her. This was about justice. The doors swung open. The first blinding flashes of cameras filled the room. Bryant tensed, his breath hitching as the noise, the shouting, the relentless storm of reporters erupted into the hallway. "Officer Bryant, do you have a statement?" "Judge Williams, how do you feel about the arrest?" "Bryant, is it true you have a history of excessive force?" The questions pummeled him from all sides, their voices overlapping, relentless, merciless. And then, the final blow. Somewhere in the crowd, an intern for one of the major networks had just uploaded the footage, the unedited, raw footage, of Bryant striking Ayana inside the courtroom. And within seconds, it was everywhere. On every screen. Every phone. Every television. Millions of eyes watching, judging, reacting. And in real time, Bryant watched his own destruction unfold. The DA's office issued a statement within minutes condemning his actions. The mayor's office distanced itself immediately. The department, his own department, released a statement saying the matter would be investigated, but there was something cold about it. Something that made it clear, they weren't going to save him this time. And for the first time in his life, Bryant felt what it was like to be on the other side of the system he had spent years abusing. He felt the helplessness. The isolation. The realization that power wasn't permanent. That untouchable men could fall. He had spent years believing himself to be above consequence. And now the world was watching him pay for it. Ayana stood at the top of the courthouse steps, watching as Bryant was shoved into the back of a squad car, his head ducked, his expression unreadable. Maybe, for a moment, just a second, she expected him to say something. A final word. A final act of defiance. But he didn't. Because what was there left to say? The car door slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, it should have been. But what happens when a man who's spent his entire life believing he's invincible finally breaks? And what happens when the people who once protected him turn against him? Because Bryant wasn't going down quietly. And the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The aftermath was immediate. The video of Bryant's arrest had already exploded across every platform. News outlets dissected every frame, political analysts debated the deeper implications, and social media was an inferno of outrage, satisfaction, and division. The image of a once untouchable officer, handcuffed, dragged out of the very institution he thought would protect him, was etched into the nation's consciousness. But justice was never clean. As Ayana stepped back inside the courthouse, the weight of it all pressed against her. The cameras, the reporters, the noise, it was still happening, still unfolding in ways no one could predict. Inside the halls of power, decisions were being made. Behind closed doors, phones were ringing, emails were being sent, and people in high places were calculating their next move. Because this wasn't just about Bryant. This was about what he represented. A system that had protected him for years had just watched him fall. And now, it had a choice, cut him loose or risk going down with him. The first sign of trouble came an hour later. Ayana was in her chambers, her hands pressed against the desk, staring at the laptop screen as the news ticker scrolled. Bryant's lawyer had just given a statement. And it wasn't an apology. Officer Bryant was unjustly arrested in a moment of heightened emotion. What we saw today was a miscarriage of justice, driven by politics and personal vendettas. We will be pursuing every legal avenue to see that Officer Bryant's rights are upheld. She clenched her jaw. They were playing the game. Twisting the narrative. Reframing the truth. Painting him as the victim. The headlines followed almost instantly. Officer Bryant speaks out, I was targeted. Is this justice or a public execution? Police unions respond to Bryant arrest, call for investigation into Judge Williams. Her phone vibrated. A text. Then another. Then a flood of them. Friends. Colleagues. Legal advisors. Some of them were supportive. Some were worried. But one message stood out. It was short. Blunt. They're coming for you. A slow exhale. She had known this would happen. She had known from the moment she gave the order, from the moment Bryant's wrists were locked in steel, from the second she saw the fear in his eyes. Men like him didn't accept consequences. They fought them. And they had an entire system at their disposal. The next morning, the retaliation began. A formal review was launched into her conduct. Anonymous sources suddenly leaked claims that she had acted emotionally, that she had been biased, that she had overstepped her authority. The police union demanded an investigation. The mayor's office issued a carefully worded statement about ensuring a fair and just process. The governor? Silent. But she wasn't naive. She knew what was happening. They weren't just trying to save Bryant. They were trying to punish her for challenging the system. Bryant may have been the one in cuffs, but the real battle was just beginning. And this wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. This was about power. She sat at her desk, fingers steepled, her mind running through every possible outcome. Every possible move. Every trap they were setting. Then, a knock on her door. She looked up. Her assistant stepped in, eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to fear. "There's someone here to see you." Ayana straightened. "Who?" A pause. Then, quietly, the district attorney. She exhaled slowly, setting down the pen she hadn't realized she was gripping too hard. It was starting. She stood, adjusting her robe, schooling her expression into something unreadable. Then, without another word, she stepped out of her office and into the storm that awaited her. The DA was waiting in the conference room, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. He was a politician first, a lawyer second. Every move he made was calculated, every word designed for optics. And right now? He wasn't here as an ally. "Ayana," he greeted, his tone clipped, professional, but cold. "We have a problem." She didn't bother sitting down. "No, Bryant has a problem," she corrected, her voice firm. "I executed the law. If that's inconvenient for some people, that's not my concern." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "This is bigger than him now," he said. "Do you understand what's happening? The department is circling the wagons. They're already spinning this. The police union is threatening a walkout if this case isn't handled appropriately." His voice dipped slightly. "And there are people in this building who don't like the idea of a judge going to war with law enforcement." She didn't even blink. "I'm not at war with law enforcement. I'm holding a criminal accountable." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "They're coming for you," he admitted. "They want to push for your recusal. If they can build enough doubt, if they can make it seem like this was personal, they can force you off the case." Ah. So that was the play. If they couldn't erase what Bryant had done, they would erase her. She exhaled through her nose, letting the thought settle, letting the weight of it press against her ribs. Then, finally, she smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was knowing. "I'm not stepping down," she said simply. The DA's gaze hardened. "You might not have a choice." Now she did sit down, folding her hands in front of her. "Let them come." His jaw tensed. "This isn't a game, Ayana." She held his gaze. "No. It's a reckoning." Another silence. Then, finally, he stood. "I'll do what I can," he said, his tone lower now, almost reluctant. "But you need to be careful." She watched as he turned, as he walked out, as the door clicked shut behind him. And then, for the first time, she let herself feel it. Not fear. Not regret. But certainty. Because the system had spent years hiding men like Bryant. Now, it was being forced to face them. And if they thought they could break her, they were about to find out exactly what kind of woman they were dealing with. The weight of everything was pressing in from all sides, but Ayana had learned a long time ago how to carry burdens that weren't meant to be fair. The corridors of the courthouse were quieter now, but that silence was deceiving. Outside, the world was on fire, divided into those who celebrated Bryant's downfall and those who saw it as an attack on the entire system. And she was at the center of it. Her office felt smaller than usual. The light filtering through the blinds cast long shadows across her desk, and her phone, still vibrating every few minutes with more messages, sat untouched. She already knew what they were going to say. More warnings. More cautious words from colleagues who wanted to help but were too afraid to stand beside her. Then, another knock. She sighed, rubbing her temples before straightening. "Come in." The door opened, and to her surprise, it wasn't another legal official. It was Detective Marcus Hale. A black man. A veteran on the force. Someone she had seen over the years handling cases in her courtroom with a quiet but firm presence. Unlike Bryant, Marcus never carried himself like he was above the law. And yet, standing there in the doorway, even he looked conflicted. She gestured to the chair. He hesitated. Then, finally, he stepped inside and shut the door. For a moment, he didn't speak. Just studied her, as if searching for something. Then he let out a slow breath and sat down. "They're not gonna let this go," he said finally, his voice low. Ayana leaned back in her chair. "I know." Marcus exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't get it. Bryant isn't just some officer who messed up. He's one of them. He was protected. He was made in their image. And you shattered that." Ayana's fingers tapped against her desk. "Are you here to warn me or to tell me to back down?" His eyes locked onto hers. "I'm here to tell you that I've been in this department for 22 years. And I've seen how this works. The department will distance itself from him publicly. They have to. But behind the scenes, they're already trying to make sure this never happens again." Ayana narrowed her gaze. "By making an example out of me." He nodded. "By making you the problem." She exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight. "They're pushing for internal investigations on you. Questioning every case you've ever ruled on involving law enforcement. Trying to find something, anything, to discredit you." She wasn't surprised. But what he said next did surprise her. "They're also trying to get to the jury." Ayana's posture straightened. "The jury isn't even selected yet." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Exactly. They're making calls. Having quiet conversations. They're trying to make sure Bryant gets a jury that'll see him as the victim." The anger flared inside her chest, but she kept it contained. Kept her face calm. "So they're rigging the system in his favor." Again. Marcus nodded. Ayana let the thought settle, feeling the weight of it press against her ribs. The system was doing what it always did, bending itself backward to protect its own, even when the truth was undeniable. But they weren't just protecting Bryant. They were protecting themselves. Because if he could fall, then the illusion cracked. And if the illusion cracked, the whole damn system might crumble. She took a slow breath, leveling her gaze at Marcus. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus held her stare for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "Because I'm tired," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I'm tired of watching good people get buried so bad men can keep their power. I'm tired of pretending I don't see it. And maybe I should have said something sooner. Maybe I should have fought harder before it got to this point. But I can't change the past. What I can do is make sure you know exactly what's coming." Ayana studied him carefully. Then she nodded. "Thank you." He scoffed slightly. "Don't thank me yet. I can't stop this. I can't even slow it down. All I can do is warn you." Her lips pressed together. She knew what that meant. Marcus was a good man, but even he had limits. Because at the end of the day, he still wore the badge. And she couldn't trust that when the time came, he wouldn't choose the institution over the truth. So she did the only thing she could. She prepared for war. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of tension. The DA's office kept their distance, careful not to appear too involved. The governor finally issued a vague statement about trusting the judicial process. The police department? They doubled down. Press leaks started pouring out, painting Bryant as a devoted officer who had a moment of weakness. Some outlets called Ayana overzealous. Others questioned her temperament. And then came the threats. Anonymous emails. Voicemails. Messages telling her to back down before it was too late. None of it scared her. It only made her angrier. But the real turning point. The moment where she knew this was about to spiral into something even bigger. It happened late at night. She was leaving the courthouse, exhausted, drained, her mind buzzing with every possible next move. She stepped into the dimly lit parking lot, her heels clicking against the pavement. And then, she felt it. That sensation. The one that prickles at the back of your neck when you're being watched. She slowed, scanning her surroundings. Then, just barely, she caught the movement. A black car. Parked across the street. The driver's window was rolled down just enough to see the faint glow of a cigarette. Watching. Waiting. She didn't react. Didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they had rattled her. She simply unlocked her car, slid inside, and drove away. But the message was clear. They weren't just trying to destroy her career. They were testing how far she was willing to go. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice. And now, she was fighting for something even bigger. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. And if they thought they could scare her into submission, they were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. The hum of the city outside was distant, muffled by the thick courthouse walls, but inside, the tension was suffocating. Ayana sat at her desk, staring at the documents spread out before her. The weight of them, of everything, was crushing, but she refused to let it show. Every paper, every motion filed against her, every carefully crafted smear campaign designed to make her the villain, it was all part of the same strategy. Discredit her. Dismantle her. Erase her. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips to her temples. The press was eating it up. Some reporters painted her as a hero, others framed her as a judge who had let her emotions interfere with justice. There were whispers, too loud to ignore, about how this wasn't really about Bryant anymore. It was about power. The system was making an example out of her. And it was working. There was a knock at her door. Sharp. Precise. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She already recognized the energy of the man standing on the other side. "Come in," she said, voice controlled, even. The door opened, and District Attorney Thomas Grayson stepped inside. He was wearing his usual pristine suit, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month, his expression carefully crafted into something neutral. Calculated. He closed the door behind him, taking his time before speaking. "You know why I'm here." She leaned back in her chair. "Let me guess. The mayor's office wants to distance itself even further, and you're here to gently suggest that I make it easier for them." Grayson sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "This isn't personal, Ayana." She let out a short laugh. "That's the thing. It's always personal when it's someone like me." His expression tightened, but he didn't deny it. "You're being backed into a corner," he continued. "I came here to give you an out before this gets worse." She tilted her head. "An out?" Grayson stepped forward, placing a neatly typed document on her desk. "This is a statement," he said. "You stepped down from Bryant's case voluntarily. You say that, upon further reflection, you believe the situation could benefit from an unbiased judge." Ayana's eyes flickered over the paper, the words twisting into something repulsive. "I see," she murmured, lifting her gaze back to his. "And in return?" Grayson hesitated, just briefly. "They let this go," he said finally. "The pressure disappears. The headlines shift. You walk away intact." She studied him for a long moment. Then she reached for the document. For a brief second, he looked relieved. Until she ripped it in half. Grayson flinched. Just slightly. Then his face hardened. You really want to fight this? She met his gaze. I'm not the one fighting, she said, her voice steady. They are. Grayson exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. You're making a mistake. Ayana stood up, pressing her palms against the desk. No, Thomas, she said, her voice low but unshakable. The mistake was thinking I would back down. He studied her, his jaw tight, his fingers curling slightly before he finally spoke again. They're not just coming for your job, he said. They're coming for your career. Your reputation. Everything. Ayana's lips parted slightly. Then, slowly, she smiled. Good, she said. That means they're scared. Grayson shook his head, his patience fracturing. You want to be a martyr, is that it? She narrowed her eyes. I want to be something they can't erase. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, finally, Grayson sighed. You always were a stubborn one. Ayana smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's why I'm still here. He lingered for a second longer, his expression unreadable, then turned and walked out the door. She sat back down, the adrenaline burning through her veins. She had made her choice. And there was no turning back now. That night, she barely slept. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, every possible trap they could set, every way they would try to twist this in Bryant's favor. Then, at exactly 2:34 a.m., her phone vibrated. She frowned, reaching for it. A text message. From a blocked number. Check your front porch. A chill crept down her spine. She pushed out of bed, moving carefully, quietly, toward the window. She peeled back the curtain just enough to get a look outside. And her stomach dropped. A thick, manila envelope sat on the steps, just barely illuminated by the glow of the streetlight. She hesitated. Then she grabbed a hoodie, pulled it on, and made her way downstairs. The night air was still, almost too quiet. She reached for the envelope, glancing around one last time before stepping back inside and locking the door behind her. She carried it to the kitchen, her fingers tense as she peeled back the flap and pulled out the contents. A file. A thick, heavily redacted police report. At the top, a name. Jonathan Bryant. Her breath caught as she scanned the pages. Then, with each word, her heartbeat pounded harder. She flipped through the documents, her fingers shaking slightly. There were complaints. Reports that had been buried. Cases of excessive force. Fabricated evidence. Brutality. And then, her stomach twisted. The last page. The one that wasn't redacted. The one with a name she recognized. Her father. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Her father had been accused of theft when she was 12. She had spent years believing it had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, a product of a system designed to break people like him. But now, she was looking at proof. Bryant had been involved. Bryant had been there. The same man who had spent years getting away with it, who had spent his career untouchable, had played a direct role in the case that had changed the course of her entire life. She sat there, gripping the papers so tightly her knuckles turned white. And for the first time in years, she shook. Not in fear. But in rage. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. And if they thought she was dangerous before, they hadn't seen anything yet. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was taken, every available space along the walls filled with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public who had fought to witness what was about to happen. The air itself was thick with anticipation, the weight of it pressing against every person present. The energy in the room felt almost electric, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. Ayana sat at the bench, her hands resting firmly on the polished wood in front of her, her face composed, unreadable. She had spent years in courtrooms like this, listening to testimony, weighing evidence, determining the truth. But this moment was different. This time, it wasn't just about one man's guilt. It was about the system that had allowed him to get away with it for so long. It was about proving, once and for all, that the rules did apply to men like Jonathan Bryant. Bryant himself sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his once perfect posture slightly slouched, his hands clenched into tight fists on his lap. The arrogance that had been his armor for so many years had begun to crack. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the jury every few seconds, as if he could will them into seeing him the way he had always seen himself, untouchable. But the reality was setting in. He had lost control. He had spent his entire life holding the power, holding the badge, holding the ability to decide whose lives would be ruined and whose would remain untouched. But now, he was just another defendant. The jury had been deliberating for 5 long hours. And then, at exactly 3:47 p.m., they returned. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the jurors took their seats, their expressions carefully neutral, but Ayana could see it in their eyes. The decision had been made. The courtroom fell into a hush so complete that the rustling of papers, the shifting of chairs, even the sound of someone exhaling too loudly felt deafening. The foreman stood. Ayana watched as he unfolded the paper in his hands, his fingers steady, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat, glancing at Bryant once before speaking, and in that moment, the entire world held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jonathan Bryant, guilty on all counts." And just like that, it was over. A collective inhale swept across the room. Then, a shockwave of emotion erupted. Some people gasped. Some whispered. Some let out a breath they had been holding for years. But Bryant? Bryant did not move. For a few long seconds, he just sat there, as if his body refused to accept what had just happened. His face went blank, his hands frozen in place, his entire frame locked in denial. Then, his breathing changed. His shoulders lifted and fell sharply. His nostrils flared. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was trying to physically hold himself together. The chief bailiff stepped forward, but Bryant did not stand. It was as if his body had shut down, as if he still believed that any moment now, someone, anyone, would step in and tell him that none of this was real. "Jonathan Bryant, please rise," the judge ordered. For a second, he didn't. Then, slowly, like a man walking toward his own execution, Bryant forced himself to his feet. His hands, which had once gripped his badge, his gun, his power, now hung limply at his sides. His sentence was read aloud. 15 years. No parole for the first 10. No special accommodations. No shortcuts. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Bryant was truly powerless. The bailiff moved in behind him, and Ayana watched as the cold metal of handcuffs closed around his wrists. The very thing he had used to subdue, intimidate, and control others was now locking him in place. The cameras flashed, catching every second, every twitch of his jaw, every flicker of fear in his eyes. He turned his head slightly, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met Ayana's. And she saw it, the realization. He had lost. And he would never get his power back. The gavel came down one last time, sealing his fate. Bryant was led through the side exit, disappearing from sight, and just like that, the man who had spent years believing he was above the law was now under its full weight. Outside, the world was waiting. The moment Ayana stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the scene erupted. Reporters were shouting questions. Protesters and supporters were chanting. News vans lined the streets, cameras turned toward her. The entire country had been watching this trial unfold, waiting to see if justice would be real this time. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because today, justice had spoken for itself. Let's take a moment to really think about what just happened. This wasn't just about Jonathan Bryant. This wasn't just about a single officer finally facing consequences. This was about a system that had allowed him to exist unchecked for years. How many complaints had been ignored? How many victims had been silenced? How many times had he been allowed to walk away, because the rules were never meant to apply to him? Bryant didn't just believe he was untouchable, he was made that way. But power is not permanent. And when the right people stand up, when the right people refuse to be silenced, even the most protected men can fall. But here's the real question: how many more are still out there? How many Bryants are still walking free, still wielding their power, still bending the system in their favor? This case might be closed. But the fight is not over. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was justice really served? Or is this just one victory in a much bigger war? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think, if it made you angry, if it made you realize just how deep this goes, then don't stop here. Subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because this is just the beginning.